March 22nd to 23rd, 1945, Nierstein, Germany. The old wine merchant of Nierstein woke to a sound he did not recognize. For months, the Rhine had spoken only in the language of war. Distant artillery, the sharp crack of American tank guns echoing from the West Bank, the thump of German mortars somewhere up the vineyards. Tonight, however, the river hummed with something new. It was a low, rasping grind, like stones rolled across a barn floor, like wagons moving without horses. He wrapped his coat around his thin shoulders and stepped into the night. The moon hung low, its weak silver light barely touching the dark surface of the Rhine. He had lived his entire life by this river, shipping casks downstream toward Mainz and Cologne since before the First War. The Rhine was supposed to be Germany's shield, a natural fortress too wide, too cold, too swift to be breached. Goebbels had repeated it endlessly on the radio. No enemy will cross the Rhine. But, as he reached the narrow dirt path leading to the waterfront, he felt his breath catch. There were shadows on the river, shapes moving, gliding, disturbing the reflection of the moon. At first he thought they were driftwood or loose barges. Then he heard the faint splash of paddles and the low grunt of men rowing. Across the water, on the western bank that had been American-held for several weeks, Second Lieutenant Jack Hennessy crouched beside a stack of coiled rope and pneumatic pontoon bladders. He shielded his watch with his gloved hand. It was a few minutes past 2300 hours. The assault boats of the 5th Infantry Division were already halfway across, packed with infantrymen hunched low, helmets brushing the gunwales. In training, they had crossed Louisiana swamps and English rivers, but now the water beneath them was the Rhine, wide, deep, and bitterly cold. Hennessy was 23 years old, but the winter campaign had aged him. He carried in his head 3 sets of numbers: distance to cross, number of pontoons required, and the timetable that General Patton himself had demanded. By dawn, the Third Army needed armor rolling onto the east bank. The engineer's job was brutally simple. Build a bridge where none existed, under cover of darkness, as fast and silently as possible. The order had gone out hours earlier. As soon as the infantry has a foothold, the bridge construction begins. No delays. Hennessy had studied the river charts. He knew the Rhine here just south of Mainz was nearly 1,000 feet wide, swollen by spring meltwater, with a steady pull that could drag a man under in seconds. But to him the river was a math problem. Depth, current, anchorage, strength, load-bearing. It was all numbers and steel. He looked across at the faint ridge line on the opposite shore. Somewhere over there, German machine gun crews crouched behind shattered stone walls. Somewhere, a spotter squinted through binoculars, trying to understand what the strange shapes on the water meant. On the eastern bank, the old wine merchant turned toward the sound of footsteps. One of his neighbors, wrapped in a blanket, approached with trembling hands. "What is it?" she whispered. He pointed across the river. "Boats," he murmured. "American boats." Faint flashes began to bloom behind the eastern hills. American artillery striking deeper targets to blind German guns near the shoreline. The night seemed to pulse with distant lightning. At 2400 hours, a green flare arced skyward from the far bank. Hennessy felt it before he saw it. A ripple of movement down the engineer line, the tension breaking like a held breath. "Go," shouted the captain. Engines coughed to life. Trucks that had waited silent among vineyards and broken farm walls for hours lurched forward, headlights blacked out, moving in a choreographed sequence the engineers had practiced dozens of times in England. Each truck carried a piece of the future bridge. Folded M2 steel treadway sections, rubber pontoons, heavy anchoring chains, air compressors, crates of tools. To the German civilians watching from the shadows of ruined houses, it looked as if the Americans were unloading an entire factory onto the riverbank. The first pontoon rafts hit the water at midnight. Teams of engineers splashed into the shallows, guiding the limp rubber shapes into the current. Air hoses hissed as compressors inflated them into rigid, bobbing platforms. Other teams hauled out the steel treadway, sliding it into place atop the pontoons, aligning tongue and groove joints by touch alone. Hennessy knelt at the river's edge, hammer in hand, driving home the massive locking pins. He counted them automatically. 1, 2, 3, 4 per section. A single missing pin could cause catastrophic failure under the weight of a Sherman tank. The river slapped cold water against his soaked boots. His hands ached, but the work went on. Pin, hammer, check, move. By 2 in the morning, the old wine merchant could see something impossible. From his vantage in the poplar trees, the river now held a faint line, a dark seam stretching from west to east, quivering gently under the current. Every few minutes, a muffled clang echoed across the water, followed by low shouts in English. His neighbour crossed herself. "Are they building a bridge?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, I think they are." On the eastern bank, American infantry dug into frozen soil, rifles angled toward the dark beyond. A wounded corporal from the 10th Infantry later wrote in his diary, "Every hammer strike sounded like a heartbeat. We knew those engineers were building the road that would save us." The work intensified. More sections slid forward. More pontoons bobbed into alignment. The river, stubborn and cold, yielded inch by inch. Shortly before dawn, a thin mist began rising from the Rhine. It curled around the steel treadway and clung to the rubber floats like white breath. Hennessy stood on the nearly completed span, feeling the faint vibration under his feet as the first 2.5-ton truck crept forward, testing the strength of the structure. Behind it, a line of headlights, hooded and dim, stretched back into Nierstein's narrow streets. The old wine merchant watched, stunned. Only hours earlier, the Rhine had been a barrier that German generals called the final wall. Now, with the sun still hidden, an American truck rumbled across the river, where only water had been the night before. The bridge had not literally appeared overnight. It had cost sweat, cold hands, bruised knuckles, and 18 hours of relentless labor. But to those who saw the Rhine that morning, German civilian, American engineer, weary infantryman, it felt like a revelation. In one night, the river had changed sides, and with it, so had the war. Understood, since you did not provide a title or summary for Chapter 2. We'll continue the story logically and seamlessly from Chapter 1, maintaining the same historical factual style, tone, and structure. March 23, 1945, Nierstein and Oppenheim, Germany. The morning haze still clung to the Rhine when Second Lieutenant Jack Hennessy stepped off the treadway and watched the first armoured vehicles roll across the bridge he and his men had assembled in the dark. The engineers had no time for pride. Pride was a luxury. They had a schedule instead. A sergeant jogged toward him, breath steaming in the cold dawn. "Sir, orders from regimental. 3rd Army wants a second bridge north of here. Oppenheim. We move within the hour." Hennessy blinked. "Another one? Already? But of course. General Patton had promised higher command he would cross the Rhine before anyone else, and when Patton promised something, the engineers understood that meant them. He wiped river silt from his gloves, grabbed his map case, and signaled his men to fall in. They were exhausted, mud-soaked, sleepless. Eyes rimmed red from the night's labor, but none complained. Engineer units rarely had the luxury of complaint. Their victories were measured in steel pinned together correctly, in pontoons inflated on time, in bridges that did not collapse under the weight of a Sherman tank. To the German civilians on the eastern bank, the scene unfolding felt unreal. The old wine merchant and his neighbors watched columns of American vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, tank destroyers pour across the brand-new structure as if it had existed for years. A woman carrying a child whispered, "How long did they work?" Another answered, "1 night." A third crossed herself and muttered, "Then the war is finished." Across the water, on the western bank, the Americans continued to unload equipment. The riverbank had transformed into something resembling a factory floor. Cranes swung gear into place. Bulldozers carved new access roads. A maintenance, detachment refilled air compressors for the next job. The engineers were not merely building bridges, they were expanding the entire Third Army's artery across Germany. By mid-morning, Hennessy and his men were rolling north in trucks bouncing along the river road toward Oppenheim. The terrain here sloped more gently, and scouting parties had already marked the ideal crossing point shallower, with a slower current, protected by a natural bend in the land. As they arrived, Hennessy saw infantry units of the 80th Division already pushing east, fanning into narrow streets and vineyards, securing the bridgehead. Smoke rose from scattered farmhouses. The rumble of distant fighting throbbed like a pulse beneath the morning calm. "Lieutenant," a major barked, striding toward him. "You built the Nierstein Bridge last night?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Build this one faster." Orders in Patton's army were often simple, direct, and merciless. Hennessy nodded and turned to his men. "All right, boys. Second verse, same as the first. Rig the pontoons, get the compressors running, and get those treadways stacked." The engineers surged into motion. Trucks backed toward the water. Soldiers heaved rubber pontoons from their beds, dragging the heavy bundles toward the shore. Air hoses hissed as black fabric bellied outward, growing firm against the river. Others unloaded the steel treadway sections, each weighing hundreds of pounds, requiring teamwork and timing to maneuver into place. On the opposite bank, German defenders watched from the tree line. Their situation was grim. The collapse of the Nierstein and Oppenheim sectors meant the Rhine, Germany's last natural barrier, was breached in two places. Some defenders fired occasional rifle shots toward the engineers, but American counterfire erupted instantly, silencing them. German artillery was too far, too scattered, too short on ammunition to meaningfully interrupt the construction. A captured German officer later told interrogators, "We thought bridges took weeks to build. We did not understand how Americans did in hours what we planned in months." By midday, the engineers had completed the first 100 feet. The river slapped at their boots as they waded out, aligning the next pontoon. Hennessy hammered locking pins until his arms felt numb. The clang of steel on steel echoed across the Rhine, merging with the rumble of distant tanks and the crackle of small arms fire. An engineer from Wisconsin shouted over the noise, "Lieutenant! Sir! Sir! Look!" Hennessy turned. A Sherman tank, the lead vehicle of an armored battalion, was already lining up at the approach ramp. The bridge was barely half finished, but it was long enough to begin traffic. Engineers had built treadways strong enough to support immediate load once anchored. Hennessy watched the tank inch forward, its treads grinding the steel plates. The bridge swayed slightly, the pontoons shifting with the current, but the structure held firm. "Keep building!" Hennessy yelled. "We're not stopping for traffic." By late afternoon, the entire treadway stretched across nearly the full width of the river. The final pontoon bobbed in midstream, waiting for its steel deck. The sun dipped behind the hills, painting the Rhine in streaks of gold and grey. As Hennessy and his men secured the last panel, the river seemed to sigh, as if surrendering. Engineers on both banks cheered. Trucks began rolling immediately, followed by tank destroyers, ambulances, supply vehicles, and artillery prime movers. The old wine merchant in Nierstein walked to the water's edge once more. The silence of the previous night was gone. In its place came an unending roar of engines and clatter of steel. A river crossed not by fate, but by force of will. He whispered to himself, "We thought the Rhine would stop them. We were wrong." On that day, in Oppenheim and Nierstein, Germany learned a brutal truth. The war would not end with fortresses, rivers, or promises. It would end under the weight of American bridges assembled in hours, stretching across the Rhine like iron declarations of inevitability. The engineers packed their tools, loaded their trucks, and prepared to move again. Tomorrow, there might be another river, another crossing, another night of darkness pierced by sparks and steel. For them, this was the war. Not medals, not speeches, but building the road the army needed, one bridge at a time. Understood. I will continue the narrative seamlessly with the next logical chapter. March 24th, 1945, the Rhine, Germany. By the morning of March 24th, the Rhine no longer felt like a river. To the soldiers of the Third Army, it had become a highway, one paved not with asphalt or stone, but with steel treadway and the relentless noise of engines. The Nierstein and Oppenheim bridges pulsed with continuous traffic, a metallic heartbeat pushing the war eastward. Second Lieutenant Jack Hennessy stood beside the Oppenheim span, rubbing gritty river sand from his eyes. He had stolen perhaps 20 minutes of sleep in the cab of an engineer truck, but exhaustion did not matter. The crossing was growing into something extraordinary, something even he had trouble comprehending. Truck companies, tank destroyer battalions, reconnaissance units, fuel carriers, ammunition lorries, artillery tractors, ambulances, command jeeps, every kind of vehicle in the massive American arsenal rolled toward the bridge in two unbroken columns. It looked like an assembly line that stretched all the way to Luxembourg. A staff officer from Corps headquarters approached him with a clipboard in hand, shouting above the roar, "Lieutenant, you are to keep this bridge open at all costs. If it breaks, if it jams, if anything collapses, you patch it in place. Understood?" "Yes, sir. And another thing," the officer added, lowering his voice. "Word is the other armies are furious. They planned their crossings days from now. Patton's move will make headlines." Hennessy nodded. The rivalry between Allied commanders was famous. Montgomery wanted to cross the Rhine in a great ceremonial blow. Bradley wanted synchronized operations. Patton wanted speed, and speed had won. On the eastern bank, the world was changing in real time. German civilians frightened, thin, many barefoot gathered along the ruined streets, watching the American columns roll past. Some hid behind stone walls. Others stared openly, bewildered by the sheer quantity of machines. A woman clutching a toddler whispered to her husband, "How can they have so many? How does a nation produce this much?" The husband answered softly, "Machines do not fear rivers." Beyond them, German soldiers trudged toward makeshift positions. They carried rifles but few hopes. Most had been pulled from shattered units, remnants of Volksgrenadier divisions, artillery batteries with no shells, and scattered Luftwaffe ground crews with no aircraft left. Already they felt the weight of inevitability pressing down. The American advance was not cautious. It came like a flood. On the bridge itself, Hennessy coordinated with a maintenance team, repairing a treadway section dented by a tank's misaligned tread. The steel panel stood warped, refusing to align with the adjoining tongue joints. A corporal hammered it futilely. "Sir, this piece is bent like a horseshoe. We need a replacement." "No time," Hennessy said. "We're cutting it flush. Bring the torches." Acetylene flames hissed. Sparks sprayed over the river as the engineers sliced the damaged steel away. They fitted a spare plate over the gap, bolting it into place in less than 15 minutes. All the while, military police directed vehicles around the repair like traffic officers in a bustling factory yard. A sergeant from an armoured battalion leaned out the turret of his tiers, Sherman, shouting over the noise, "How's the road look, Lieutenant?" Hennessy grinned. "Strong enough to carry this whole damn war." The tank rumbled forward, its weight making the steel decking hum. Behind it came a column of tank destroyers with their long, lean barrels, followed by trucks towing howitzers artillery that would soon speak for the American advance. Then came the fuel trucks, their cylindrical tanks glinting in the pale sunlight. Fuel was the lifeblood of Patton's army. Without it, the great thrust after the Rhine would falter. With it, nothing in Germany could hope to stop them. Further upstream, German officers conversed in hurried tones, studying maps spread across the hood of a dusty staff car. A captain traced the river line with trembling fingers. "They have crossed in 2 places. We have no reserves left to throw them back." An older major shook his head. "It is not the crossing that frightens me. It is the speed. They build bridges as if, by magic." A younger lieutenant muttered, "The Rhine was always meant to save us. Now it carries our doom." Their words reflected a deeper truth. Germany had imagined rivers would serve as walls. But American engineers turned rivers into pathways. By early afternoon, the U.S. 7th Armored Division rolled forward, treads grinding, engines roaring. Infantrymen sat on tanks, legs dangling, passing tobacco and jokes. Their morale surged, crossing the Rhine had felt. For months, like the final impossible barrier. A private leaned toward his squadmate. Hard to believe we were freezing in the Ardennes 3 months ago. Yeah, the other replied, watching the engineers work. Now, look at 'em. They'll bridge the damn Atlantic if Patton asks. On the riverbank, Hennessy allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. He looked at the 2 bridges, steel, rubber, sweat, and willpower, and felt something he had not expected: awe. The Rhine had long stood as a symbol of Germany, its power, its pride, its permanence. But now, American industry had rewritten the river in a single night and day. What had once been a natural barrier separating nations had become a conduit for an unstoppable army. The old wine merchant from Nierstein appeared again along the waterfront. His face was lined with fatigue, his eyes hollow. He watched the endless traffic passing eastward and whispered to himself, "This is how nations fall. Not by guns alone, but by roads built faster than we can understand." Hennessy overheard him, but said nothing. He turned back to his men, shouting, "Engineers! Pack your tools! We're moving again tonight!" They groaned, but they moved. They always moved. That was their war. Build, break down, build again. As dusk approached, the Rhine glimmered beneath the steel pathways that spanned it. The river had not been defeated, it had been outworked. And for Germany, the meaning was unmistakable. The Americans were no longer approaching, they were already here. Below is the next chapter, continuing seamlessly in the same voice, pacing, structure, and historical atmosphere. All numbers are written out in full. Length: approximately 800 words. Title chosen to follow the narrative arc logically. March 24th to 25th. 1945. The east bank of the Rhine, Germany. The first full night after the crossings did not resemble war as the Germans had known it. War, to them, had been a thing of slow movements and desperate shortages, of waiting for ammunition, waiting for fuel, waiting for orders that never arrived. But the night after the Americans bridged the Rhine was a different kind of darkness, one filled not with dread, but with motion. A night where the flood of men and machines refused to slow simply because the sun had gone down. On the Oppenheim Bridge, lanterns hooded with blackout covers cast thin slivers of yellow against the steel treadway. The faint glimmer was enough for the military police to direct traffic, their arms carving sharp silhouettes as they signaled trucks and tanks forward. The roar of engines blended into a single, ceaseless vibration that spread across the water like a living thing. Second Lieutenant Jack Hennessy sat on an overturned crate at the eastern approach, scribbling notes into his engineer logbook. Every bridge had a life cycle: construction, load stress, fatigue points, and predicted maintenance intervals. Under normal conditions, an engineer team would evaluate a bridge over days or weeks. Here, the bridge had been open for only 12 hours and had already reached the load of a civilian highway used for months. A sergeant approached, wiping grease from his hands. "Sir, we got minor deformation at Joint Section 6. Nothing critical, but she's flexing harder than expected. She'll hold," Hennessy said. "We reinforce at 0300. The sergeant nodded and disappeared into the noise. Hennessy closed his logbook and exhaled. The night air smelled of river mud, diesel fuel, damp rubber pontoons, and faint traces of cordite drifting from skirmishes further east. Somewhere in the dark, the 8th Tank Destroyer Battalion was engaging German rearguards. The dull boom of their guns pulsed in slow, rhythmic intervals. A jeep rolled up the ramp, stopping beside him. A colonel stepped out, brushing dust from his sleeve. "Lieutenant," the officer said, "Headquarters wants to know how long this bridge can sustain maximum traffic." Hennessy hesitated. It was not the kind of question an engineer answered lightly. "At full load, sir. If we maintain repairs every few hours, indefinitely." The colonel grinned. "That's what I like to hear. Good work." As he drove off, Hennessy felt a mixture of pride and disbelief. Indefinitely, the word echoed in his mind. It meant that the Rhine, Germany's ancient shield, had lost its meaning in a single night. The river, in the shattered outskirts of Nierstein, the old wine merchant sat inside the remnants of his home. The roof had collapsed in the previous month under a shell burst, but the lower rooms remained intact. He lit a small candle and poured himself a thin measure of the last wine in his cellar. The rumble of American armor passing through the streets vibrated the stones beneath his feet. His wife sat beside him, holding a blanket around her shoulders. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. He nodded. "Yes. It does not stop." "No," he said softly. "It will not stop again." They listened in silence. From their broken window, they could see the faint glow of the bridges, as if two steel rivers had been laid across the water. She shivered. "We thought the Rhine would protect us." He sipped from his cup, tasting dust more than wine. "The river protected us in other wars. Not this one." What changed? He looked toward the east, where American armor was, already advancing beyond the vineyards. The world changed, and we did not. On the east bank, farther inland, American reconnaissance units moved through orchards under a moon obscured by drifting clouds. The night was alive with movement infantry fanning out along country roads, bulldozers clearing obstacles, tank columns forming up for the next day's push. A corporal leaned from his half-track and watched the endless flow from the bridge, his voice half awe, half exhaustion. "Back home they say America is the land of plenty. I figured that meant food. I didn't know it meant everything." His driver chuckled. "Plenty of trucks, plenty of tanks, plenty of ammo, and plenty of engineers who don't sleep." Down by the riverside, those engineers were still working. Hennessy's crew was halfway under the bridge, balancing on narrow pontoons as they checked support chains and waterline drift. Flood season was beginning. The Rhine could rise 6 inches overnight. A shift of that scale meant increased strain on anchor points. Hennessy knelt beside a pontoon, checking the chain tension with his gloved hands. The cold water lapped at the metal, dark and restless under the lantern light. "Sir," one of his privates whispered. "You ever think about how fast this went up?" Hennessy looked along the length of the bridge steel panels gleaming faintly in the night, vehicles rolling like an endless procession of shadows. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think about it every minute. Feels like we're building the war as fast as we're fighting it." Hennessy smiled faintly. "That's the idea." Around 0100 hours, an eerie silence swept across the bridge. Traffic paused as military police cleared a stalled truck. For the first time all night, the Rhine breathed audibly, its slow, deep current whispering beneath the steel. Then, just as quickly, headlights reappeared from the west, and the river's brief voice was smothered, once more by engines. From a hill east of Oppenheim, a German lieutenant watched the scene through a pair of battered field glasses. Beside him, a sergeant muttered, "It is like watching an entire army move through the eye of a needle." The lieutenant lowered his glasses. "No," he said quietly. "It is like watching a nation move." Below them, the bridge gleamed in the darkness, alive with motion, unbreakable in its purpose. And for the first time, the German lieutenant felt something more final than defeat. He felt the war ending, in steel, in engines, in the never-ending thunder crossing the river that was never meant to be crossed. The Rhine had lost its meaning. And Germany understood it. March 25, 1945. Beyond Oppenheim, Germany. Dawn on the second full day after the crossing revealed an east bank already transformed beyond recognition. What had been, mere days earlier, a fragile foothold of infantry crouched in vineyards had now become a broad, expanding plain of American momentum. The fog lifted slowly from the Rhine, rising like steam from a giant iron machine that had run through the night without pause. Second Lieutenant Jack Hennessy stood beside the Oppenheim Treadway Bridge, watching a column of self-propelled artillery thunder across. Each M7 Priest weighed nearly 25 tons, yet the bridge held, flexing with a deep metallic resonance. Hennessy felt that vibration in his bones. It was the sound of inevitability. He turned to his sergeant. Traffic count, since 0500? Over 400 vehicles, sir. Armor, infantry, tank destroyers, fuel carriers. It's all flowing east. Good, Hennessy said. Keep them moving. Behind him, military police shouted at a stalled jeep, clearing it from the approach ramp. The drivers looked half awake, half dazed, but the flow continued. The war itself seemed to march with them. A few miles inland, across rolling farmland and broken vineyards, the advancing American spearheads met the German line, or what was left of it. The German 1st and 19th Armies had planned to hold the Rhine. They had dug trenches, sighted machine guns, and placed what artillery they could spare in rewired positions. But that plan had dissolved in a single night. Colonel Walter Romer, commanding a ragged battalion of Volksgrenadiers, stood beside a ruined farmhouse, staring at the dust clouds rising from the American columns. "They have bridged the Rhine faster than we can retreat from it," he murmured. His adjutant, a young conscript with hollow cheeks, swallowed hard. "Herr Oberst, the men ask if reinforcements are coming." Romer shook his head. "No, reinforcements are not coming. Trains are bombed, fuel is gone, and Berlin calls these places secondary. We are alone." The distant rumble grew louder. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks. Not a probing attack, not a patrol, a continuous wave. This is no longer a front, it is a flood. On the Oppenheim Bridge, a sudden shout erupted from the western side. "Make way! Ambulances!" 2 olive-drab ambulances rolled forward, lightly bouncing over the steel panels. Their rear doors swung open as medics leapt out, carrying wounded infantry from the eastern fighting. The bridge did not pause for them. Traffic split around the ambulances with practiced ease. A medic, blood spattered on his sleeve, called across to Hennessy. "Lieutenant, you boys saved lives." Without this bridge, those wounded would still be pinned down on the riverbank. Hennessy nodded, but said nothing. Compliments felt strange, out of place, like warmth in winter. Engineers worked. Others fought. The bridge existed because it had to. He returned to his inspection rounds, checking pontoons, adjusting anchor tension, tightening bolts. Every clang of his wrench blended into the symphony of the passing army. Far ahead, near the village of Treadway, the first major German counterattack formed. A scratch force of a few remaining Panzer IVs, damaged assault guns, and infantry remnants attempted to stem the tide. Their commanders shouted orders, their engines roared, and their machine guns rattled through the orchards. But the Americans were ready. A battalion of Sherman tanks rolled forward in perfect formation, their turrets already traversing toward the German positions. Behind them came tank destroyers, then infantry advancing with practiced discipline, followed by mobile artillery that quickly unlimbered and began firing. The engagement lasted less than an hour. Artillery shells shattered German armor. Sherman tank rounds tore through stone walls and tree lines. Machine guns swept the fields. What remained of the German battalion broke apart, some fleeing east, some surrendering, some simply walking toward the Americans with hands raised. One captured German corporal stared at the endless stream of American vehicles rolling from the direction of the Rhine. "It does not end," he told his American interrogators. "You defeat us not with soldiers, but with roads. You build roads faster than we can destroy them." Back at the Oppenheim crossing, the pace only increased. Trucks carrying pontoon replacements arrived. Fuel tankers idled in long lines waiting to cross. Motorized artillery crews reorganized into new columns. Engineers cleared debris and checked weld seams on steel plates battered by tank treads. A lieutenant from the Logistics Corps approached Hennessy with a sheaf of papers. "Lieutenant Hennessy, we need you on the other side. Command is preparing additional bridging operations east of the current crossing. There's talk of pushing a bypass route." Hennessy wiped grime from his eyes. "When do we move?" The logistics officer grinned. "You know the answer." "Immediately." Hennessy gathered his men. Some had managed an hour of sleep in the shadow of a fuel truck. Others had eaten only a cold ration bar since the night before. But when he called out, "Engineers, form up!" they rose as one. Because this was their war. No front line, no rest, no glory. Their victories existed in steel, bolts, and the pounding of hammers. On a hill overlooking the river, the old wine merchant and his wife watched the scene below. The sun was high now, glinting off steel and water. The bridge shimmered like a polished blade cutting through the Rhine. She asked quietly, "What will happen now?" He answered without turning his head, "Germany has broken. You can hear it." "Hear what?" He gestured at the rolling thunder across the bridge. "That sound, that is a nation being overtaken. That is the future arriving." They watched in silence as another long column crossed the bridge vehicles, stretching beyond the horizon. The Rhine, once a fortress, now served only one purpose: to carry the war deeper into Germany, and nothing, no army, no river, no plan could stop it anymore. March 26, 1945, the road to Darmstadt, Germany. By the morning of March 26th, the resistance east of the Rhine no longer behaved like an army. It shuddered, fractured, and folded in on itself like a collapsing wall. What had once been a formidable defensive line anchored on the great river that Germans believed no enemy could cross had become only a memory, and the reason for its dissolution rumbled ceaselessly across the pontoon bridges that the engineers had laid in the darkness. Second Lieutenant Jack Hennessy rode in the back of a jeep as it bounced along the freshly secured east bank, en route to a new bridging site south of the main crossings. Every few minutes the driver swerved around another burnt-out German vehicle or a crater left by retreating engineers attempting, too late, to deny the roads. "Hard to believe this was a front line 2 days ago," the driver muttered. Hennessy nodded, but remained silent. He had seen battlefields transformed by time, weather, or retreat, but he had never seen one transformed in hours. It felt as though the American army had simply stood up and walked east, sweeping the landscape with it. Ahead, the road widened as they approached a crossroads where military police directed traffic. Columns of tanks rolled north, artillery units turned east, fuel carriers headed toward forward dumps, and infantry moved on foot along the ditches. The flow resembled a living river, one fed by the bridges at Nierstein and Oppenheim, each minute pushing more steel and fuel into Germany. A military policeman waved the jeep through. "Engineer detail? Keep moving. Bridge headquarters is expecting you." The jeep broke free of the congestion and sped toward a small orchard where the advance headquarters of the engineer regiment had pitched a temporary command post. At the orchard, officers clustered around a map spread over the hood of a muddy 3-ton truck. A major pointed to a thin blue line, another Rhine tributary feeding into the main river. "We need a Bailey bridge here by nightfall," the major said. "Armour wants 2 attack routes running in parallel. The Germans are falling back faster than anticipated. If we bottleneck on a single road, we lose momentum." Hennessy stepped forward. "Sir, what's the span?" 80 feet. Standard double-single Bailey will do it. We already have the panel trucks rolling." "And the far bank?" Hennessy asked. "Light opposition. Recon says only scattered riflemen." Hennessy nodded. "We'll start immediately." The major clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. You boys built the gateway. Now keep it open." A mile away, that light opposition had gathered less like defenders and more like ghosts. The remnants of a Luftwaffe field division, stripped of aircraft, equipment, and hope, crouched in the wet grass beside the small stream the Americans intended to bridge. Oberfähnrich Dieter, Haydn studied the water, barely 20 feet wide. "It is nothing," one of his men whispered. "Why defend this?" Haydn did not answer. He watched the dust rising from the west, the dust of thousands of moving vehicles. His sergeant approached. "Herr Oberfähnrich, perhaps we should fall back." Haydn exhaled. "If we run, where do we run to? Frankfurt? It will fall. The main river? They will cross it. The Taunus Mountains? They will bypass them." The sergeant swallowed. Then what do we do? Haydn looked at the stream again. We do what we can. And then, we surrender. He said the last word quietly, as if the trees themselves might judge him. Back in the orchard, Hennessy led his engineer platoon toward the stream, Bailey Bridge components clattering in the truck beds behind them. The approach roads were narrow, hemmed by brush and low stone walls. German civilians watched from their doorways, some fearful, some hollow-eyed, some simply exhausted. Woman clutching a scarf called out to the engineers as they passed. "Please, do not fight here. My children are asleep." Hennessy slowed his pace. "Ma'am, we're building a bridge, not a battle." She nodded, though her eyes did not show understanding, only desperation. When the engineers reached the stream, the first shots snapped overhead. Rifles, scattered, harassing fire. "Contact front!" shouted a corporal. The infantry escorting the engineers took position, returning fire in controlled bursts. The Germans did not press their attack. They fired aimlessly, as if required by duty rather than conviction. Hennessy crouched behind a tree, scanning the far bank. "Lieutenant," a sergeant called. "It's only a handful." "They're not trying to stop us." Hennessy nodded. "Then we proceed." With covering fire from the infantry, the engineers moved forward. Bailey Bridge construction began in textbook fashion. Panels locked into transoms, pins hammered through, lugs, stringers lowered into place. Chesses aligned across the span. Each metallic clang echoed across the valley, louder than the enemy's scattered gunfire. At one point, a German bullet struck a Bailey panel with a sharp ping. The engineer holding the far end did not flinch. "Keep moving," Hennessy ordered. Piece by piece, foot by foot, the bridge took shape. It was as if the engineers were laying down the future, one steel plank at a time. As the final panel locked into place, the remaining Germans broke. A white cloth, an undershirt tied to a stick, rose above a small hedgerow. The firing stopped. A young German soldier emerged with trembling hands. Behind him came more 6, then 12 tattered uniforms, empty canteens, gaunt faces. Haydn stepped forward, his helmet hanging loosely from its strap. "I am Oberfähnrich Haydn," he said softly. "We surrender." An American sergeant took their weapons and gestured them toward the rear. Haydn turned toward the newly finished bridge. "You built this in a single hour," he murmured. Hennessy nodded. "We build them faster than rivers can stop us." Haydn closed his eyes. "Yes, that is what we feared." By afternoon, Shermans and tank destroyers thundered across the Bailey Bridge, heading deeper into Germany. Dust rose behind them, drifting eastward like the shadow of a storm. The East Bank had not merely been seized, it was unraveling. And every new bridge, the big ones, the small ones, the hidden ones thrown over nameless streams, tore another thread from what remained of German defense. The Rhine was far behind the Americans now, but its meaning died a little more with every mile they advanced. March 27th to 28th, 1945, Gross Gero to the main river. The German state had once imagined the Rhine as an immovable curtain of iron and water, a barrier that would buy time, halt divisions, and force the enemy to bleed for every mile gained. But on the roads east of Nierstein, that illusion dissolved under the weight of American vehicles, stretching so far that one end vanished into the horizon. What had taken centuries to mythologize had taken the Engineer Corps a single night to dismantle. By March 27th, the U.S. 3rd Army Infantry, Armor, Artillery, Reconnaissance, engineers moved with a momentum that felt less like strategy and more like physics. Once the first pontoon bridge had locked together and anchored itself in the current, everything behind it surged forward. Fuel convoys rattled east in long serpentine lines. Medical trucks carried wounded west toward evacuation hospitals newly established on the far bank. The traffic never ceased. Not for rain, not for artillery, not even for the bodies of destroyed German vehicles that had to be shoved aside by bulldozers. Second Lieutenant Jack Hennessy rode in a half-track toward Gross Gerau, where a new river obstacle, no more than a swollen tributary of the Main waited to be bridged. He had slept less than 4 hours in 2 days, and his uniform carried the smell of wet canvas, cordite, and spilled gasoline. Every part of him ached, but his eyes remained bright. The war had reached a stage where exhaustion itself became a kind of weapon. The engineers simply worked longer than their enemy could resist. "Lieutenant," the driver called over the engine noise, "you hear the news?" "No," Hennessy replied, rubbing his forehead. "Which news?" "Patton wants the Main by the 30th. Hennessy nodded slowly. "Then we get it by the 29th. In the outskirts of Gross-Gerau, German civilians gathered along the street as American vehicles rolled through. Some waved white cloths. Others stared blankly, as if unable to reconcile their belief in the Rhine's protection with the American soldiers passing before them like a tide. One old man stepped out from a doorway. "You crossed the Rhine in 1 night," he said in halting English. "Impossible." Hennessy paused. "Not impossible, sir. Just engineering." The old man shook his head. "No, something larger." He tapped his temple. "I lived through the last war. We crossed rivers by building little footbridges under fire, praying the pontoons held. But this," he gestured toward the horizon where the sound of artillery thumped steadily. "This is something new. The river surrendered before we did." East of town, the engineers reached a shallow ravine where the tributary wound through muddy banks. Smoke drifted in the distance columns of retreating German units, setting fire to fuel dumps and abandoned supply depots. The crack of small arms fire echoed faintly through the trees. Captain Maldin, commanding the engineer company for the day's mission, spread a map on the hood of a jeep. "Span is 50 to 60 feet here," he said. "Bailey or Treadway?" "Lieutenant." Hennessy studied the water. The current was sluggish. Banks were low. "Treadway will be faster. We can have it in before dusk." "Then Treadway it is," Maldin replied. "Speed matters more than elegance at this point." "Any enemy nearby?" Hennessy asked. "Scattered pockets, mostly Volkssturm and stragglers. Nothing organized. But don't get complacent. A desperate rifleman can still ruin your day." Across the ravine, German Lieutenant Dieter Haydn, who had surrendered 2 days before but had since been attached as an interpreter and local guide, watched the American preparations with a hollow expression. He had chosen to cooperate after his capture, partly out of practicality, partly out of a strange, rising admiration for the enemy that had built bridges faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy them. He approached Hennessy hesitantly. "They will not resist here," he said quietly. "Most of them have already thrown away their rifles." "What about officers?" Hennessy asked. Haydn gave a sorrowful half-smile. "Most officers are either dead or running. No one believes in holding ground anymore." Hennessy nodded. "Then let's build." The Treadway Bridge was a marvel of American logistics. A floating roadway supported by hollow steel pontoons, delivered in sections, locked together, and anchored by cables hammered deep into the banks. It was designed to follow the advance, leapfrogging rivers as fast as armor could drive. Engineers unloaded the pontoons first, sliding them down the muddy slope and into the water with a splash. A squad ferried cables across in a rubber boat, securing them to trees and driving stakes deep into the earth with sledgehammers. Each task was executed with practiced rhythm. Drop the tread sections. Panels clanged as they were lifted, carried, and bolted into place. Center line secure. Pontoons aligned. Start the winch. The bridge inched across the river as cables tightened, the panels locking with a metallic snap. Gunfire crackled briefly from the woods, forcing the infantry escort to fan out into defensive positions. A single German machine pistol sputtered from behind a haystack until a rifle grenade silenced it. "Keep going!" Hennessy shouted. By late afternoon, the treadway was complete. The first jeep crossed it cautiously. Then a Sherman tank followed, its tracks rattling across the steel panels, the weight causing the entire structure to flex but hold. Maldin watched with satisfaction. "That's another road open. Third Army will like that." Hennessy, sweating and streaked with mud, allowed himself a brief breath of relief. Across the ravine, Haydn stared at the finished bridge with a mix of awe and despair. "You build them faster than we can retreat," he whispered. Hennessy glanced at him. "We build them faster than you can believe." Haydn nodded slowly. "Yes, that is why it is over." That night, as darkness settled over the valley, the sound of traffic rolling across, the new bridge echoed like distant thunder. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, tank destroyers, artillery tractors. Every hour, more vehicles poured across. The Rhine, once Germany's pride, now fed the very army that was dismantling the Reich from within. On the road toward the main river, the rumble continued through the night, unbroken, unstoppable. A moving bridge of steel, fuel, and men. A bridge Germany could no longer withstand. March 29th, 1945, the west bank of the main river. By March 29th, the advance of the U.S. Third Army no longer resembled a front line. It looked like a rolling factory. Every hour, fresh units pressed eastward. Armored columns, tank destroyer battalions, miles of 6x6 trucks, and behind them, the unbroken chain of engineer companies, whose job was to ensure that nothing, not rivers, craters, or blown bridges, slowed the momentum. Near the main river, the engineers of the 5th Infantry Division arrived at dawn, stepping out of their trucks into a world of broken timbers and collapsed stone. German sappers had wired the original bridge and detonated it during the night, leaving its shattered archway submerged in swirling brown water. Smoke drifted across the river, the remnants of burning fuel and ammunition stores abandoned by retreating German troops. First Lieutenant Jack Hennessy surveyed the scene, boots sinking into the mud. "Well," he muttered, "they sure didn't want us using this crossing." Captain Mauldin joined him, chewing the end of a pencil as he studied the map. "They're trying to buy time, but they're out of time. We bridge this today." Hennessy nodded. "What's the order of battle?" 2 battalions stacked up behind us, armor behind them, and corps artillery waiting on the far side once we open the road. Patton wants the main behind him before midnight. Hennessy exhaled slowly. "Then we give him his crossing." Across the river, German Major Matthias Kruger crouched inside a ruined millhouse, field glasses pressed to his tired eyes. He was one of the handful of officers left from a unit that once numbered in the hundreds. Now he commanded perhaps a dozen stragglers, men too wounded, too exhausted, or too shell-shocked to fight effectively. He watched the American engineers fanning out across the bank with bewilderment. "They work like ants," he whispered. "Industrious, tireless. And always more of them." An enlisted man beside him asked, "Herr Major, will they attempt another pontoon bridge?" Kruger lowered the glasses. "They won't attempt one. They will build one. They always do." He looked at the river and felt an ache in his chest. Once, the Main had served as a barrier. Now it felt like an inconvenience, something the Americans would brush aside with the same casual efficiency they applied to everything else. Hennessy's company worked with practiced rhythm. Men unloaded pneumatic hammers, anchor stakes, steel tools, reels of cable, and, most importantly, the pontoon sections themselves, hollow aluminum floats designed for rapid deployment. Boats into the water, rope teams ready. "Get those anchors prepped. Bring up the treadway panels." The noise rose in layers, engines idling, metal clanging, shouted commands, the slap of waves against the first pontoons. A corporal called over the rush of water. "Sir, current stronger here than at Nierstein." Hennessy crouched beside the river, dipping a gloved hand into the water. The current tugged hard. He nodded. "We'll need double anchoring, 2 lines on every pontoon. Put the strongest crew on the far shore cables." "Yes, sir." Gunfire crackled in the distance. German snipers, few and disorganized, fired sporadic shots from the ruins on the opposite bank. American infantry returned fire with disciplined bursts, gradually silencing the resistance. Captain Mauldin approached Hennessy, ducking as a bullet sparked against the rocks. "Snipers?" Hennessy asked. "Not many," Mauldin replied. "Just enough to be irritating." Hennessy nodded. "Then we proceed." Speed is our armor. Even as engineers worked, the first wave of assault boats slid into the river. Infantry paddled hard, zigzagging across the current. Once they landed on the far bank, small firefights broke out short, violent exchanges as German defenders chose between resistance and surrender. Major Kruger listened to the distant gunfire. His men waited for orders that no longer made sense. "Major," one of them whispered, "we cannot hold them." "Should we withdraw?" Kruger shook his head slowly. "No. There is nowhere to withdraw to. The war is running past us." He looked at the bridge site again. "They will build their crossing regardless of what we do." By mid-morning, the first pontoons were locked together. The engineers hammered stakes deep into the bank, while cable teams pulled the growing line of floats outward into the river. The structure groaned and swayed under the relentless current, but the anchoring lines held. "Treadway panel, lock it in place, next section." The metallic rhythm of assembly echoed across the valley. Sweat ran down faces, gloves tore, muscles strained. But the engineers did not slow. Hennessy checked his watch. They were ahead of schedule. On the opposite shore, American infantry secured a wide perimeter. Smoke rose from several burning German trucks. Prisoners, some wounded, some simply exhausted, were escorted back across the river in assault boats. Major Kruger stood with his hands raised, surrendering. When an American sergeant frisked him for weapons, Kruger said quietly, "Tell your commander the river did not fail." "We did." The sergeant paused, unsure how to respond. Hennessy, passing nearby, replied simply, "The river never had a chance." By late afternoon, the bridge reached the center of the river. The current grew more violent there, forcing the engineers to work knee-deep in the freezing water. One pontoon slipped out of alignment, swinging dangerously. "Hold it! Hold it! Cable team, tighten line 3. Get that hammer down before it swings loose." Hennessy waded into the water himself, shoulder deep, helping push the wayward pontoon back into position. Cold tore through him like electricity, but he kept pushing. With a final shove, the pontoon snapped into its cradle, and the next treadway panel locked against it. The bridge held. A cheer went up from the bank. As dusk settled over the main, the final treadway section was bolted in place. The first jeep rolled across, its headlights cutting twin paths of light across the steel surface. Behind it came a Sherman tank, its weight pressing down on the structure. The treadway flexed, dipped, and held firm. Hennessy exhaled in relief. Captain Mauldin clapped him on the back. "One more river, behind us." Hennessy nodded. "And more ahead." Mauldin grinned. "Lieutenant, at this rate, we'll reach Berlin before the ink dries on the map." That night, as the bridge vibrated under the ceaseless rumble of American traffic, Major Kruger sat on the far bank under guard, watching the endless stream of vehicles crossing the river his division had once sworn to defend. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "They do not cross rivers," he said. "They erase them." He looked at the glowing American headlights snaking eastward into the darkness. "And once a river is erased," he whispered,